program. That's okay. Welcome back to the fourth session of our Lenten program. Exploring death and dying. This is our fourth session. And this is a continuation of a session 2 weeks ago, preparing the bereaved. Part 2, continued information and discussion on advanced directives. Just a reminder that next week, your homework is to bring what's known as a linking item, an item that you would, maybe was owned by someone who has died, that links you to them, that you have to begin our session on legal aspects surrounding our deaths, which will be next week. So that's my part of an introduction, and we'll go ahead and get started.
So we're going to start with our spiritual practice this time instead of ending it. We'll have an ending practice as well, but for our opening practice, we want you to grab a blank sheet of paper, and we've got some here, we've got some on the table there, and a pen. And we're going to be writing what's called an erasure poem, and I'll just share a little example. These are this is a collection of books of poetry that are the sonnets of Shakespeare that a professor of mine erased. So she took the sonnets and got rid of all the surrounding text until she found a much smaller poem within it. I'll see if I can find a fun example. One. This one just says, this is from Sonnet 22. I am of one date in time's furrows. To just erase the whole poem down, kind of distilled it. It's a way of distilling text into something more essential, more core. So don't worry about that part yet. What we're going to do first is just a free write. And the goal is just to keep your pen moving. Don't even worry about complete sentences or making too much sense. Keep your pen writing until we chime the chime. And what you're responding to is what makes your life worth living. So free write, don't worry about form. Anything that comes to mind, what makes your life worth living? We'll go for a couple minutes, so just keep that pen moving. Don't worry if you're still writing, you can always go back and revisit. So now your goal is to erase all but 3 words. And if it's easiest, you can just circle those 3 words.
That's right.
If it feels too rough to erase them or cross them out, just circle. So you're highlighting, you're distilling down to 3 words. When you're done, maybe turn to the person next to you, and if you want, you can share those 3 words. You can also just share if it surprised you how that process felt.
That's okay. I was a little. Mostly it was.
It's like some great conversation. In general, was that a helpful exercise? Yes. Good, good. Surprising for anyone? Yeah, yeah, for us too, actually.
Yeah, we even knew it was coming, and we still were surprised by ourselves.
Yeah. Keep these in mind. We'll return to these words at the end, but our hope is that this gets us into a heart space where we're already thinking about some of the questions that you'll then be discussing with your agents or with a buddy today. So I found this helpful, just getting to the heart of the matter kind of quickly. Let's see, we wanted to start with a couple stories from this amazing book called Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. He's a physician who talks a lot about end of life and making advanced care planning, difficult decisions. Brilliant book, highly recommend it. But we wanted to share 2 stories from the book that help illustrate, I think, the spectrum of decision making. So in this first one, he's interviewing his friend, Dr. Susan Block. And she is talking about her father's surgery. So the evening before surgery, father and daughter chatted about friends, family, trying to keep their mind off what was to come. The father's about to have surgery for a tumor in his spinal column. When she left for the night, and then she left for the night, halfway across the Bay Bridge, she recalled realizing, oh my God, I don't know what he really wants. He'd made her his healthcare proxy, but they had talked about such situations only superficially. So she turned the car around. Going back in was really uncomfortable, she said. It made no difference that she was an expert in end-of-life decisions. I just felt awful having the conversation with my dad. But she went through her list. She told him, I need to understand how much you're willing to go through to have a shot at being alive and what level of being alive is tolerable to you. We had this quite agonizing conversation where he said, and this totally shocked me, well, if I'm able to eat chocolate ice cream and watch football on TV, then I'm willing to stay alive. I'm willing to go through a lot of pain if I have a shot at that. She says, I would have never expected him to say that. It was to her out of character for her dad, but if she hadn't asked, she wouldn't have known that that was his kind of line in the sand. I'm going to fast forward to Atul Gawande, the author, whose dad is actually facing the exact same surgery. He says, and they've been debating the surgery for a while. So he says to his dad, is it time for surgery? I asked him. The dad said, I don't know. He said, there was time, I realized, for our own hard conversation. Atul says, I'm worried. I recalled the list of questions Susan Block, who we just talked about, the palliative medicine expert, said most, and posed them to my father one by one. I asked him what his understanding was of what was happening to him. He understood what I understood. He was becoming paralyzed. What were his fears if that should happen? I asked. He said he feared that he would become a burden on my mother and that he wouldn't be able to take care of himself anymore. He couldn't fathom what his life would become. My mother, tearing, said she would be there for him. She would be happy to take care of him. Already the shift had started. He was having her do more and more of the driving, and she arranged his medical appointments now. What were his goals if his condition worsened? I asked. He thought on this for a moment. He wanted to finish his Rotary. He was president of the Rotary Club. He wanted to finish his Rotary responsibilities. And he wanted to make sure his college and family in India were going to be all right. He wanted to visit them if he could. I asked him what trade-offs he was willing to make and not willing to make to try to stop what was happening. He wasn't sure what I meant. I told him about Susan Block's father, who also had a spinal cord tumor. He'd said that if he could still watch football on television and eat chocolate ice cream, that would be good enough for him. My dad didn't think that would be good enough for him at all. Being with people and interacting with them was what he cared about most. I tried to understand. So even paralysis would be tolerable as long as he could enjoy people's company. No, he said, he couldn't accept a life of complete physical paralysis, of needing total care. He wanted to be capable of not only being with people, but also still being in charge of his world and life. His advancing quadriplegia threatened to take away that soon. It would mean 24-hour nursing care, then a ventilator and a feeding tube. He didn't like the sound of that. He didn't sound like he wanted that. I said, never, he said, let me die instead. So same situation, same surgery, two very different people, two very different wishes. And we wanted to start with those stories because it highlights for us that the goal really is the depth of conversation with our agents to really understand what's that line in the sand, what's the point at which living is no longer living to you. And it can be really highly individual. And notice that there's no discussion of advanced directives in these stories of the documents. Those are byproducts. The conversations help guide when and at what point someone might be listed as DNR, when and at what point someone might want certain treatments, but really the documents flow from those conversations. So our goal today is to kind of guide you into a time of having those conversations, maybe continuing ones that you've already started, and hopefully just beginning that process. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. So, and Susan Block, that physician, had even had the document completed with her dad, right? She was named. So we're asking you, yes, do the document. We really like the VPOAs. We're asking you to flip it, have the conversations before and during and after and forever, along with that document. And there are three kind of buckets that most people's values fall into when we're talking about this. One is longevity. How long do you want to be around? One is function. So that's Atul's dad. He did not want to live if he couldn't physically function in a certain way. And for him, paralysis was the no-go. And the last is comfort. How much are you willing to go through? Right? And these are overlapping. I think of the ice cream and the football, that's function. It's also a little bit comfort, right? And so how much of how much are you willing to be in discomfort so that you can stay around longer to watch your grandkids grow up a little bit, that kind of thing. This is always going to change. I think of it as this dance amongst those three. Today, you might feel one way, in 6 months, you might feel another, and especially if during those 6 months you have experienced this illness, right? So today we're imagining what we would feel like if, right? Have the conversation now, but continue to have it, because those three buckets might change for you. How long will you stay? Do you want to stay around? We, as Alex says, we all want all three.
We all want all three. Longevity, function, comfort. Of course we want all three.
Right.
It's just that at a certain point in all of our lives, one's going to take higher priority. So at this point in my life, I'm willing to go through quite a bit of pain for the possibility of longevity. But at some point, I'm going to want to focus on function, or I'm going to want to focus on comfort, because the trade-offs for the amount of longevity I might get are going to be much smaller. So generally, we have one that's ranked a little bit higher than the other two, and that'll shift over time. So you don't have to have a final answer to that, but just think for yourself today. If I could rank one highest, what would it be? And that'll be on a form that we'll, on a little document we'll give you here in a second. But, oh yeah, so when my mom was going through treatment for breast cancer towards the end of life, she had brain radiation. And I remember her saying that was just the most exquisitely painful process, and that was the tipping point for her. She would never go through that again. That was, to her, too much pain, too much suffering, and to let her go if it ever came to that.
And if we would have asked her when she was your age,
Oh yeah,
she would have had probably something different function. Maybe function she would have been using her
longevity. Yeah.
longevity
Yeah.
function,
Yep.
right?
Right. But at that point, if it came down to brain radiation, choose comfort and quality of time as opposed to quantity. Did you want to share about anything else at this point? No, I don't. Yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you some conversation guides and quite a bit of time to continue the conversation with your healthcare agent. Does anyone not have their healthcare agent with them? We're going to buddy people up who can kind of practice the conversation with one another.
You be with us now today?
Yes.
Now, yeah.
Oh, my-
Okay, yeah, super.
So raise your hand if you don't have your person with you today.
And on chat, go ahead.
And then
let
just
Felicia
pair up. If
know.
you can find somebody, maybe it's right next to you.
We're good. Are you good with?
Yeah.
Does everyone have a partner?
Yeah, just so we're hoping that this is good practice if you didn't get to have this conversation with your medical agent. And even if you did and you got cut off, your homework is to continue what you didn't get to talk about. And we also know it's an evolving conversation, that this is the focus, and that the documents you can see kind of flow out of this and support our goals and wishes. But it's often we thought it might be easier to start with some of these questions. And of course, we'll have different answers along the way. And Pete, yeah.
What I was gonna say is, this is what we're gonna do with our two daughters.
Oh,
We will have a conversation. And we will use,
I love it.
it's very good.
I love it. Good. So for those who can hear, Pete and Lynn are going to do this conversation with their two daughters and walk them through what they decided from, which I, brilliant next step for anyone that has family they need to include.
Sarah,
Yeah.
I'll just come up here so that everyone. can
Thank
hear.
you, Sarah.
I was also thinking it would be a good idea to have a living document for my medical person, and basically go through this and not only have a conversation, but write it up. And then every year or whatever, when I get a medical sort of thing, like, oh, okay, now you really only have, you update it.
Yes.
Because having been in a situation with my mom, it's hard to remember the conversation.
Yeah.
So
Great. I love that. I'm going to pass out. We also have a form. We're not going to go through it today, but this is a guide for you to have a version of this conversation with your physician. Maybe now, maybe down the road. But one thing I've learned is that doctors have a hard time. They're people too. They have a hard time sharing difficult prognosis. Sometimes it means we have to give them permission to say, hey, it's okay. I know nobody has a magic ball. I know no one's God, but I would love to know an honest take on my prognosis, especially if you do have a terminal diagnosis. And then let them know your goals, because we've been talking about how the medical default is really do everything possible until the last possible minute. And so if we don't want that, it's really, really helpful for you to be empowered to say to your doctor, here's my line in the sand, because they might not, they're not always good at knowing how to ask that question. They want to cure as much as they can till the end. And that's not always what's in our best interest. So I'll pass this out. Did you want to share a little bit about, you know?
Yeah, but first I want to say, Raven and I have been having this conversation for years because I live with chronic conditions, and still today new things came up, right? So I tell you that not to take away any of your grounding or your footing and what you know to be true, but just to invite you to remain open always. So I was first diagnosed and given a terminal diagnosis of 2 weeks in 2000. For many years after that, I was what's called a DNR, which means I had a do not resuscitate order, because it wouldn't have helped me at all. Likely a DNR, a CPR, compressions, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, would end up, at that point, it would have ended up with me on a respirator always. And I didn't want to do that. So I lived with my situation, stayed until 2015. So for 15 years, that was set for me. And then in 2015, I was again in the hospital. I was in cardiac ICU, and our kids were 16 and 13. And I was very, very sick. And I took the DNR away. And the reason is not that I had changed. I was much sicker because I had lived with sickness for 15 years, but because my kids and our situation had changed. So Raven is not their biological father. Their biological father at that point did not live in this state and was telling me, if you die, the kids, of course, will come live with me. Well, that was unfathomable to me, that if I died, they would be taken away from the person who had helped raise them, from their friends, from their teachers, from their life, and go to live with a person who actually didn't let them mention my name, right? So I couldn't, even if there was a shred of a chance that I could stay alive, even if I didn't know it, even if I was totally unaware that I was alive, I was going to do it. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
I tell you that most people don't have to go through this. And I don't, here's the thing that makes me a good model and also very odd. I don't have a disease progression. There's no data for what's going to happen to me. There are no numbers, right? So I can't say to the doctor, you know, how much longer do you think I have? Because they will tell me we have no idea, right? There's no statistic we can use, which in some ways is terrifying. In some ways it's so freeing, but it requires that we are constantly updating each other. And I also, for that reason, don't have a living will. I've had a living will for a long time. But because I won't know, I won't get the 6 months. I won't get those kind of prognoses. It's more important to me that I have the conversation with him. And this is something we want to highlight too, is that when we say, I don't want this, right? I don't want to be intubated, for instance, I don't want to be on a breathing tube. That is a really hard and fast rule. But there are all different reasons to be on a breathing tube, and there's all different prognoses when we go on a breathing tube. So that's an important conversation to have at the moment with your agent in advance, but your agent can talk to your healthcare provider. And they could say, hey, Raven, we think we need to intubate Amy. And he'll say, wait a minute, what do you think? How long do you think she's going to be on? Is she ever going to come off? Because those are two very different things. Would I want to be intubated for 3 days if they were relatively sure that I would come off with some quality of life based on my buckets? Yes, if they knew that I was going to be intubated and unaware forever and need to go to a long-term care facility, that's a different conversation. So for me to just think of, I won't ever do this, I will do this. The other reason it's important for me to stay open is that this is all imaginary for most of us in this moment, right? Even if you're already sick, we're still imagining a point at which you feel differently. So my dad forever said, I don't want to live with dementia. If I show signs of dementia, take me out in the back like a dog. My dad, of course, developed dementia. We don't do that in this country, take me out, thankfully. But then the question was, so is the person in front of me my dad? And he would never, with dementia, have said, I don't want to live. At that point, he was very adamant about living. So do I honor, he said this to me for years before he's this person? It's an ever changing conversation. And again, I don't say that to confuse you. I just say that as an invitation to stay open and keep having the conversations with yourself, with God, with your agent, your family members. Do you have any questions about that?
You can see on the form, again, we won't go through the whole, but I would take a look at the guide for talking to your physician. And there's a part that says for any potential treatments. And some good, just helpful questions to ask. So like Amy's saying, not no ventilator ever or yes ventilator. What are the potential risks of this treatment? What are the hidden costs? What realistically could this treatment provide me? And then just a note there that often patients expect treatments to buy them 10 to 20 years, and the doctor's thinking I might get them 6 months to a year. So just having those honest conversations, regardless of what the treatment possibility that's before you, those options are. And then we know that the document asks you a lot of questions about innovation, artificial nutrition, a lot of hypotheticals, and that we can't get into every potential scenario today, and we can't get into every treatment and its pros and cons, but there are some really good resources that we wanted to highlight for you if and when you need those. So this is one really good book called Hard Choices for Loving People. It goes into CPR, feeding tubes, palliative care, a lot more. And there's a set, we'll put these at the back that you can browse. These are books by Barbara Carnes, who's kind of the hospice whisperer. And she has books on living with a life-threatening illness, pain at the end of life, the dying experience, and caring for those who are caring for the dying. So really good resources out there. Were there other ones? Yeah.
What was the title? Hard Choices for what?
Hard Choices for Loving People.
Okay.
Which is a great title. It's Hard Choices for people who are loving, hard choices for loving other people. We'll have a couple copies that people can look at in the back. Yeah.
How do you spell the last name?
Dunn, D-U-N-N. $8 on Amazon. Highly recommend this book.
Well,
And
then
it's called what?
Hard Choices for Loving People by
Can
Hank
you
Dunn.
put that one out there so we can,
Yeah.
as we go out and
Yep.
copy?
We'll have 2 copies in the back that you can take a look at.
take a
Okay,
picture.
and you
of
can
it.
look at it right now. Yeah. Okay, any other questions about the conversation? We're hopeful that this is just the start, like you all have shared. Mark and I just made a plan to revisit this every year. And
A good anniversary or birthday or
Yeah.
something celebration,
Yeah.
right?
hard conversation and then a nice dinner. Good. Is there anything else? Good. Good, yeah, we're right on time for our kind of closing practice. Any final thoughts or questions? Yeah, so the types of books, also the type of music, if you can't say for yourself, that's huge, right?
Have some control over your
Yeah,
environment,
uh-huh.
is what I'm hearing, and of your experience.
Even just smells, what kind of smells you want to have around. Truly, yeah. That's a great, have a running list of those kinds of things for how to care for me when I can't care for myself. What feels comforting, what doesn't. Yeah, I love it. Any other thoughts, things, ahas? Well, the way we're going to close is with the same music that you all had at the end of last week's session. And what we're going to invite you to do is to revisit those 3 words that you came up with for yourself at the beginning, and just kind of hold those 3 words in meditation, just in silence as we allow our time to close with music and silence, like we always do. And don't forget your linking object next year, next week. I'm wearing some of mine, actually. These are some of my mom's earrings. So bring the linking object if you can, or if you don't have it physically, maybe bring the story of it.